So my co-chairs are both here in the room. Andrea Thomer, she is over at the University of Arizona. Andrea, do you want to say anything or do you just want to wave?
I'll wait.
Okay. And Joan Damrow, who's from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratories. Good morning or good afternoon, Joan. And I'm Val Stanley. I work at the Oregon State University Marine and Geology Repository. The three of us are the co-chairs of the ESIP Physical Samples Curation Cluster. I don't know if anyone here is unfamiliar with ESIP, and if this is your first call with ESIP, then welcome. That's the Earth Science Information Partners. I call them the data people. Lots of really smart and innovative folks coming together to work on various pieces of making data more available to the world. And so our main focus is talking about ways to make samples part of the FAIR data ecosystem. And you can join our listserv and learn more about us on the ESIP Physical Samples Curation Cluster page. We're one of many collaboration areas. So these are community groups getting together to talk about and work on various projects. Right now, our main focus is putting together author guidance on how to work with samples in their publications. And we'll be working on potentially wrapping that up at the ESIP meeting this July, which is both in person and online. And there should be more about the session times coming together soon. Any other questions before we get going? I should also introduce our wonderful ESIP fellow, Chad Langtot, who is here helping us out, keeping things running along the way. Thanks, Chad. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to Kirsten Leonard and Sabes Cho, who have done a wonderful job of getting the word out about this session today. And they're here to talk to us about the future of SESAR. So go ahead, take it away.
Oh, okay. Yeah, hi, everybody. I'm glad many of you showed up. So we have prepared a whole bunch of slides, but I really want to encourage everybody to get engaged, give their comments either in the chat or raise their hand. We will try to watch out for anybody who wants to say something and make sure that you can say. This really is for us the start of a process to engage the community as much as we can in creating the next version of SESAR. And you will see in the presentation that there are changes happening at the moment. And so it's a really adequate and convenient time to raise your voice, bring your feedback if you have used SESAR before, and if not as well, to tell us what you need when it comes to the digital management of your samples and your collections. Okay, Sabes was already presented. I think we also have Sean Cow on the line. There he is. He is the developer who puts it all together and makes it work. And then as the first team member, we have Dave Vigles on, who puts his brain into all the architecture and the functioning of the system. And he will talk for part of the meeting later about the iSamples infrastructure software that SESAR is moving into. So with that, I think I'm going to start sharing my screen and try to get this set of slides going. Can you all see it? Is it shared?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, good. I didn't hear anybody say anything, so I was concerned. All right, so for those of you actually, is there anybody on the meeting right now who doesn't know what SESAR is and hasn't used it before? would be nice to see that in the chat. You just say, yep, never used it or don't know about it. So I would be interested in seeing if there is anybody. So SESAR is really a system that functions as a platform for the community to make their samples more discoverable, more accessible, and also reusable by basically making information about the samples available online. And part of the intention in SESAR is that samples are to be connected with all the data that were derived from them and all the information that has been produced and is published in the scientific literature. I need to do this. So SESAR is actually approaching its 20th anniversary, and I hope we can celebrate next year, maybe. It started in 2004 with a small grant for exploratory research that we obtained from the Earth Sciences and Ocean Sciences Division at NSF. And it was initially the reason I've put up this old screenshot from one of my first presentations ever about SESAR, is that it was the development of the IGSN initially that required the creation of SESAR. It was really the repository for all the metadata we wanted to obtain in order to assign unique, globally unique identifiers to samples. I should point out that as in this list shown here, since 2010, SESAR has been operated as part of the AIDA data facility, the Interdisciplinary Earth Data Alliance. AIDA was renewed last year and is now funded until 2027. So that's as long as SESAR is currently funded. AIDA is really focusing on the curation, accessibility, reusability of data acquired on Earth and space science samples. So its last proposal title was the Next Generation Data Infrastructure for Fair Geoscience Samples. And this is at the heart of SESAR's mission, is to apply the FAIR principles to samples, that basically making sure that samples are easily discoverable and documented with sufficient information to make them reusable. I think it's a bit misleading that I'm saying here samples should be openly accessible. Yes, that's true, but that's not what SESAR can do. We're not the repository of the samples that can make them openly accessible. But what we can do is clearly maintain openly accessible metadata. We assign persistent identifiers, the IGSN, to the samples that are cataloged in SESAR. We try to encourage rich and standardized metadata that SAPES is the one who will review any metadata coming to SESAR and make sure that they are correct and as rich as possible. And we will in the future also make sure that clear licenses are included in the sample metadata profiles that we have. This is just a sort of overview of all the different pieces that SESAR delivers to its users. There is a metadata embargo possible for up to 2 years. The metadata that we store can link to external resources, including publications or funding awards or other sample metadata records sitting in other local systems and so on. Obviously, the IGSN registration, I already mentioned that. So SESAR operates a variety of user interfaces. One is the search of the metadata catalog. Another one are the landing pages of samples that basically display and provide access to all the information stored in SESAR about a sample, including images as well, currently limited how many images you can store about a sample, but they're there. And then I think most importantly is my SESAR as the application that allows users to register their samples and then manage the metadata, update the metadata, print them out, create labels for the samples, and all kinds of good stuff that I'm not going to dive deep into. SESAR also has a number of interfaces for machine-to-machine interaction. There is a lot of information for developers online. Samples can be registered through a web service. And as you can see in this graph that we just generated, about 70% of all samples that are registered per year over the last few years have been registered through XML upload over web services. In total, SESAR is approaching in some way the 5 million sample level. We have about 1,500 users, but of those only in the range of 100 to 120 users regularly use the system, repeatedly registering samples over the year. So what we wanted to really emphasize is that there are a whole bunch of issues with SESAR that we are fully aware of. And it is our limited resources that have prevented us from taking care of everything. But we're doing this now. And among the most important one is a necessary technology refresh. As I said, the system started 20 years ago and hasn't really seen a major overhaul. There are a number of system improvements that we have on our mind right now, and that's making the whole sample registration process more efficient by automating some of the metadata validation and the ingestion of metadata into the catalog. Desperately necessary is an improved catalog search and options, and delivering more options for users to retrieve search results. What we also would like to do is offer more tools for helping to capture metadata while you're working with samples in the field and in the lab, or basically collecting the samples in the field and in some cases also in the lab, and partner with other systems that have already developed those capabilities. We know from our long-term experience that we need to become more flexible with respect to the metadata we accommodate, as we have seen new sample types come in on an ongoing basis. And every time it's a problem to fit the metadata into our current metadata schema. We want to improve the capacity and the capabilities for storing images of samples in the system. We have noticed that obviously accounts become orphaned when researchers retire, when they move away from, like, especially graduate students, postdocs, move out of their job with samples, and suddenly we have accounts that nobody really takes care of. There is no contact anymore. The sample metadata are not maintained, so that's a problem for us that we need to address. Most of all, we need to improve the engagement with our user community, and this is clearly one of the topics that we wanted to talk to you about and get your ideas and feedback on. We've been thinking a lot about the difference between the services we provide to individual researchers to get IGSNs, to manage their samples in my SESAR and so on, versus services for institutions such as sample repositories and museums, who may run their own metadata catalogs, who have very different needs from SESAR than individual researchers have. And obviously, I mean, as I said, we're funded until 2027, but we need to think about a long-term business and sustainability model. And especially with respect to the business model, we need to take into account that because of the recent changes to the IGSN, there are costs involved now with delivering IGSNs to users should they register huge numbers of IGSNs. So what have been the recent changes that we are accommodating and will accommodate in the near future? So first of all, many of you know that there were substantial changes to the IGSN, both its structure, its registration, procedure, the syntax. So the IGSN now is a DOI, and also it is no longer focused on geoscience samples alone. It is being applied in other domains, be it archaeology, biology, material sciences, and so on. So that has an impact on how SESAR operates, I think. The migration of the IGSN registration process to DataCite, as I mentioned already, it has financial implications. It also has opportunities for us for new services to provide. And I will get to that in a bit. Important is that we've already started the SESAR migration to the new iSamples architecture. And that is a great opportunity to improve user functions, user interfaces. So again, feedback is needed. And then there are a couple of developments planned as part of the new AIDA2 cooperative agreement with the National Science Foundation. One is along the lines of creating more tools to obtain IGSNs in the field. We will develop interoperability with the StraboSpot application, which is a field application to support work on stratigraphic sections, on sample collection, and so on. So that's a great opportunity. And another thing that AIDA will be doing is building a sample nexus, which is intended to provide a connection between the samples and the data and publications, a sort of a discovery point for those connections. Coming into the topic of the IGSN transition. So most of you probably know that in 2021, the IGSN organization, IGSN EV and DataCite entered into a partnership that is intended and will support the long-term sustainability of the IGSN, will make it more scalable because the infrastructure had been quite limited in its capacity. And it will allow the IGSN organization to now focus more on community activities and specifically on supporting efforts to set standards for sample metadata and registrations. So the IGSN, the way it was created initially, you will probably remember, was a 9-digit code with a 3-digit user code and a random string of alphanumeric characters. That was integrated into a URI with the IGSN.org for the IGSN.org domain. And That also because that the IGSN services were using the handle system, both handles and DOIs would resolve to the IGSN landing pages. Since 2023, the IGSN now has a different syntax. In the former days, all allocating agents in the IGSN system had the same prefix of the handle system, which was 10273. 10273, right? And in the new system, where the IGSN basically has become a DOI, every allocating agent has their own unique DOI prefix. And therefore, the suffix may be, there's no control anymore of keeping the suffix unique. As I said, the old IGSN resolved to via handle.net, the new one resolves via DOI. The most important, I think, that everybody needs to be aware of is, the IGSN in the old days could just be reported as this 9 or in some cases 10 or 15 digit suffix. Now the IGSN should always include the prefix, the DOI prefix. So what has happened at SESAR, all IGSNs that have been registered with SESAR until December 2022 have by now been re-registered with DataSite and have a DOI counterpart and therefore will resolve in the long term. The IGSNs that are registered now with SESAR since the beginning of 2023 share a prefix that is 10.58052. Organizations can request their own prefix, but that is one of the services that we're only considering, and we need to figure out if that is really something that organizations may want and what implications it has for SESAR with its membership in DataSite. SESAR will continue to assign the user codes, and the suffixes in SESAR IGSN IDs will remain unique, where every user will have their own unique user code for the suffix, which is the way we will ensure that every IGSN is unique within the prefix 10.58052. When it comes to displaying the IGSN, there is fantastic documentation at DataSite that I'm pointing to here. There is recommendations for the long display that includes the entire DOI URL, basically, but there are ways to shorten the display of the IGSN, and DataSite specifically gives instructions how to do that you can have the IGSN sort of in the column heading of a table and so on. So I didn't want to go too deep into that. I just really sending you to the documentation on the DataSite website. Overall, the registration process at SESAR will stay the same, but one of the aspects of the new registration process is that DataSite will only accept samples that have all the required metadata. Samples that have missing metadata can only be assigned a draft IGSN that will not be findable. It will become findable only when all the metadata are provided. Then it can be made publicly available for searches. What are these mandatory metadata at DataSite? Here is a quick list that provides an overview. The identifier, which is obviously the DOI, the creator of the IGSN, which can be, it's a little fuzzy. It can be the collector, it can be a chief scientist or curator, basically the person who deposited the sample into a repository. There's a title, again, giving the sample a title is not entirely straightforward. You can use the type of sample material, local name. SESAR has created a mapping of the metadata we have had for 20 years in the system to populate these metadata fields at DataCite. The publisher is obviously SESAR here. Publication year is the year when the sample was registered. We give it a term of either material sample or feature of interest, depending on if it was a real physical object or if it was a site that was registered. And then overall, every one of the IGSNs has a resource type general that is physical object. Again, you can look up in more documentation at DataCite. So with that, let me briefly stop here and see if there are any questions anybody has for the current status of SESAR and after the changes to the IGSN. And I have a hard time actually having my screen open and okay, I see a few comments, but I don't see a question so far. Anybody there with a question who raised their hand? Oh, there, Laura.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I am Laura Turner with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and you guys have helped us archive some samples in the past, and I think I'm tracking about the IGSN change, but as we have systems that point to those components off of SESAR, will you be notifying us when you make those changes so we can change our reference points, if that makes sense?
They don't need to be changed for you. Everything that existed in the old system is functional because it was re-registered.
Ah, oh, well, that just saves me a lot of work. So
yes,
thank you. Thank you for answering my question.
Joan.
Yeah, thanks so much for this overview. I was just curious on the mapping, or like title in particular, like how did you map the existing SESAR fields to title? I was just curious what our titles will be for our existing samples.
I think Sean can probably answer that for
The
me.
title will just be the sample name.
Okay. That's okay. And is there like a mapping somewhere that we can see of like the SESAR fields to the DataCite?
I don't think so at the moment, but we
Yeah,
can
let's put that on our list to actually have that on the website, what the mapping is. That's a good point. We should have done that.
Okay, thank you.
There is a mapping that was done by the working group that with DataCite, and I'll get a link for that.
But that was, yeah, I assume that other allocating agents had different metadata profiles. So I'm not sure that every allocating agent used the same mapping, right? Crystal.
Hi.
Hi.
So I just had a quick question about how you had said that the information wouldn't be released unless all the metadata was in there. I know that some of our clients are a little spotty on giving us what we would consider to be all the metadata. So what are the points that would be considered the complete? I guess I missed
the complete
that.
is when these 6 metadata fields are all complete. And that should be, I mean, that information should be there. SESAR has always required that there is a creator and there is a sample name. It was always a requirement that you had an account with us, which gives us the registrant basically, and you had to give a name of your own sample identifier for the sample. So that fields two already. The identifier is the IGSN that is generated. So there goes number 3.
Right.
Here is available. The resource type and resource type general are available. And the publisher is SESAR. So all the metadata are basically there. The specialized information, you know, what lithology is it, or what are the geospatial coordinates and so on. That's not part of the mandatory properties.
Okay. Then I think we're good there.
I think it should be good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome. Cheryl. Whoops, I don't hear you.
Cheryl, your audio is not working.
If you have any question, just put it in the chat and we're going to try to. All right, so moving on, now we're getting into the future, and I've mentioned the future already a number of times. So, oops, I need to close you all back down again. I can't see you anymore. So obviously SESAR has its own vision of where it wants to go in the future. So while 20 years ago, the focus really was on creating a globally unique identifier for samples that didn't exist at the time, that is no longer SESAR's primary concern. We're still assigning the IGSNs for community members, but we're not operating the IGSN anymore. So we think that we need to focus on sample discovery, again, in the context of fair samples, making sure that samples can be found and that they can be integrated with the whole ecosystem, the digital data ecosystem. So that is really the vision for the AIDA2 sample nexus. The other thing, and I think Dave will talk a little bit about that, is that by adopting the iSamples architecture, SESAR will also become more, or the content of SESAR will become more accessible and discoverable through the central discovery service of the Internet of Samples project. The other thing I already mentioned is a focus on the community and really helping the community compile, promote best practices, metadata, workflows, providing tools that people have developed and sharing them either for metadata capture or sample management and so on. We want to make sure that policies are shared for sample access and curation, that SESAR can provide guidance how to comply with these policies and so on. And, you know, I want us to really think about how can SESAR and the ESIP physical samples cluster leverage each other's activities and communities. Again, something I mentioned already is we have a vision that we can extend services for larger organizations, institutions, repositories, research infrastructures, and so on, by doing a better job with our sort of shared accounts for larger groups, by potentially providing separate DOI prefixes for these organizations, if so desired, creating customized landing pages that have the branding of these repositories and so on. So those are, you know, things that have come out of our own brainstorming. And we really want to find out what are your wishes and expectations for SESAR into the future. So before we dive into this, I wanted to really give you an introduction in what the changes are to SESAR that are coming up through the migration to the iSamples architecture. And with that, I'm handing over to Dave. And Dave, should I just continue advancing the slides for you?
Yeah, that'll be the simplest, I think, Kirsten, if you could.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. So just a very brief introduction to the iSamples project and the infrastructure we're building. The main goal with iSamples is to really facilitate shared access to information about physical samples from a diversity of physical samples. And there's a couple of key elements to doing this. One is related to infrastructure, and the other is related to the data model we're going to be using to describe the samples. Next slide, please, Kirsten.
Whoops.
And this is obviously a very simple abstraction of the sort of the architecture of the iSamples infrastructure. And we can basically follow the diagram from the top left, where a sample is collected in the field, and there may be subsamples taken from it and so forth. But ultimately, some metadata about that sample is gathered into a collection. iSamples provides the infrastructure that enables external access to that collection by transforming the records which are collated in that collection into a common model. And that model is built upon a core. So there's a common core which applies to all physical samples. And that common core may be extended to facilitate additional properties and other attributes appropriate for different types of samples. So, for example, the SESAR collection may include extended attributes to properly document mineral samples and so forth. Other instances of iSamples in a box can be attached to other collections, or content can be added directly to iSamples in a box instances. And they all share this common core data model, as well as a common interface. And all the information may be aggregated into a single central repository, which we call iSamples Central. But that's not the only architecture. Any other iSamples in a box instance may aggregate content from any other iSamples in a box. So you can have ad hoc architecture or hierarchies of information. So SESAR, for example, may choose to aggregate content from other instances of iSamples that contain relevant information. And so build a domain-specific hierarchy of information that provides discovery services across all of the mineral samples, for example. Next slide, please. To get things going, there's 4 initial test cases which we're working with, and these are all actively contributing content now. And they're chosen specifically to be a fairly diverse representation of the types of physical samples from archaeology, the geosciences with SESAR, and biodiversity, different types of biodiversity records from like geome, which includes genomic information, and then traditional natural history information and similar content from the Smithsonian Institute. And these 4 test cases, as I mentioned, were chosen to be deliberately diverse to force us into designing a core model that applies across everything. That's a physical sample. Next slide, please, Chris. And this is a very sort of high-level schematic, if you like, of what a record looks like. At the core, there's the physical sample information, which is tied specifically to the physical sample itself. And then there's related information, which is gathered into different classes of or categories of information, such as agents, which would be people or similar entities, curation information, event information, relations, keywords, and of course, information about the sampling sites and coordinates. Although this looks a little bit complicated, it's really a fairly simple model. And the groupings here are really to facilitate multiple instances within a particular record, for example. Another important aspect to facilitate discovery is the use of these 3 core vocabularies listed at the top there, describing the type of material that the physical sample consists of, the type of specimen that the sample is. So it'd be like a core or an individual organism and so forth. And then also the type of feature that the sample was actually taken from. So that would be like a coral reef or the ground, the glacier, and things like that. And these three vocabularies are very useful for quickly navigating through the potentially hundreds and millions of samples which would be aggregated into this common infrastructure. Next slide, please. The core model is really what drives a lot of the infrastructure and then the presentation of that infrastructure. The user interface includes the basic tabular view of information, as well as next slide, Kirsten. The a spatial rendering of samples. And this is a three-dimensional view supported by the cesium infrastructure. It's all open source, and so it's quite a compelling mechanism to explore local sample availability. And this example is showing Moorea in the South Pacific. An important aspect of every record in iSamples is the use of a unique identifier. And as you can see with the red dot in the middle there, if you click the next slide, please, Kirsten. You can click on any of these samples and pull up the basic metadata about each of these records. And as you mouse over, you can see the identifier and so forth. And if you were to click through the link in that table, it'll take you back to the original source collection, where you can find additional information about the sample if you choose. There's various ways of navigating the search interface, including full text search, as well as searching on other properties. And next slide, Kirsten. Navigating the hierarchy of vocabulary terms, which I mentioned previously. The vocabulary terms are arranged in a hierarchy, so they get from very broad terms down to potentially very narrow terms, all orchestrated by the SCOS ontology infrastructure. Oh, yeah. And the actual definition of the vocabulary structures themselves are used to drive the construction of the user interface. So as vocabularies are extended for particular domains, the user interface can follow those extensions along as well. So it's a very flexible dynamic system, which is built, relies heavily on the core data model and extensions to it for the presentation of the user interface and facilitating different types of discovery mechanisms. And next, please, Kirsten. So we're migrating the SESAR infrastructure into this iSamples infrastructure. And the initial steps, and well, an important part of this process is really minimizing any sort of downtime or other impacts to end users of the SESAR system. So in the ideal sense, you should be able to continue to utilize the same tooling and approaches for accessing content, registering content, and so forth, as we migrate to iSamples. But there'll be additional, hopefully more capable ways of interacting with the system as we progress to the iSample infrastructure. The initial steps include mapping the core, the SESAR database into the iSamples core model. A lot of that is already done. We're about to embark on including additional properties now. There's other aspects which we need to incorporate, which is streamlining group management and dealing with things like orphan content that Kirsten mentioned earlier, and just overall improving the management and curation process for handling content, and streamlining the mechanisms for uploading content to SESAR. And another important aspect is that we realize that people will want to come to iSamples and to SESAR to actually retrieve content to do potentially additional analyses. So it's really important that we understand the needs of the community as far as accessing and downloading content. So one question that'll be in the questionnaire that we'll show soon is what format do you want to retrieve data in? There's a variety of different things that we can support, and we'd like to ensure that we cover what the community needs. I think that's about it that I need to talk about, Kirsten. And I will mention that there's been many people involved in the production of SESAR, and especially the production of the metadata model, which Steve is on the call right now. I noticed he has been instrumental in building a lot of that infrastructure, and yeah, we really look forward to the integration of SESAR. And if anybody has any questions, please pick up now, or we can answer them later.
Kirsten, I think we should circle back and answer Cheryl's question. She put in the
I
chat.
haven't looked at where.
She
It's
said,
in the chat.
what are the future costs and future anticipated costs, and who will be asked to pay?
So I mean, the costs aren't dramatic at the moment. I mean, we have become member of DataSite, and that's a few $1,000 per year. The number of IGSNs that will be for free, we haven't decided, but I figured it's going to be somewhere below 10,000 IGSNs per year. The real impact comes when organizations want to register over 100,000 IGSNs per year or so. And, you know, again, it's not going to be dramatic costs. I figure it's going to be in the range of, you know, a few $1,000 maximum, but it will depend on what other developments organizations would like us to do. So it's kind of, you know, what I envision is a service for payment. You know, do you want your own customized web pages? Well, we'll see how, you know, how sophisticated you want that to be and what that would take us to develop. So there's development costs and then ongoing operational costs, but we haven't, you know, become incredibly specific about it. And actually there is in our AIDA grant or cooperative agreement, we have funds for a workshop next year to talk about this sustainability model and business model with the community. So, you know, we're not there yet at first I want to really explore, is there a demand for that service? And once we know, then we will dive deeper into figuring out what that service can be and how extensive or small it should be envisioned. That's sort of my approach right now.
And I'll just expand on that just a little bit. One of the concerns, or one thing we have to consider is there's a huge diversity in the volume of registrations going to SESAR. And so smaller collections may register tens to hundreds of samples. Others may register many, you know, thousands. And so if the volume is very high, then that, you know, can trigger some costs with DataSite that will need to be covered somewhere. And so we're, you know, an important part of the process of estimating what the cost recovery strategies need to be is getting a good feel for the volume of content that some people would want to register through SESAR.
Right. I mean, our experience actually is that the huge numbers of samples that are registered are usually when a repository or a museum registers their entire collection that they have assembled over decades or centuries, maybe. The ongoing registration is in most cases way below 10,000 per year, even the large organizations. All right, time has passed by way too quickly, I think.
Kirsten, we have another question in the chat.
Oh, we do. All right. we're starting to think about how to link across samples. And I think the schema has a sample relation component. Is there a controlled vocabulary for those relationship types yet? That's a question I'm handing over to Dave or Steve.
We do not have a controlled vocabulary for the specific relation types yet, but that is definitely on the, I think we have a draft of potential relation types, but it's not fully fleshed out yet.
I put a link in the chat,
Oh,
the-
excellent. Thank you, Steve.
Google Doc, and we're definitely looking for input on that.
Yes.
I was just going to say that's a great opportunity to put somebody in and say, hey, if you're interested in this, you know,
Yeah.
it would be great to have you in the room and get this right. I mean, there's obviously a lot to base on the data side metadata that has, you know, relationships, but there is very specific relationships among samples and with other objects that will need to be added to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question.
Was that the question, or is there a new, we have a draft? Oh,
We have a comment from OSU in the chats.
yeah, not to beat a dead horse, but regarding costs, would you start encouraging PIs to think about potential costs in the proposal writing process and including support in their budget, or is this a bit too early? I would say, I mean, the costs that, or the charges that we envision of fees are not gonna be for individual researchers. I don't envision that we will go to that level of detail. Would also, just from our perspective of management of a cost center, would just create more costs on our side than any money that comes back in. That's the service that we are providing, that we, you know, basically have in our proposed activities of the cooperative agreement. It's just when large organizations come and say, you know, we want to register our 300,000 samples through you, and we would also like to have these customizations in the whole system. That's when the flag will go up and say, well, you know, we can talk about that, how we can do that for you. And again, you know, we will find out if there is actually a demand. I'm really glad to see the questions, to see that there is a flag coming up. I was just going to ask Sapes, did we have a Google document where people can enter their comments?
I could start one and send it right now. I thought I made one, but let me just do that really quickly.
Yeah, and we should let people know already that we have at the very ending of the slides, we have a QR code that will get you to a Google form for a short survey about SESAR and your ideas, what is good, what is not so good, and so on, that we can use to further elaborate on you know, the changes we want to make. I see that, you know, time, as I said, has flown by, so I'm just going to dive into the last slides that I have. And I'm not going to talk much about the sample nexus here, because I mentioned it already, even though it's only been at a pretty high level. I've mentioned the orphaned accounts, and, you know, one of the solutions that has come up, I mean, we don't get to know on the SESAR side if somebody will not use their account any longer, if somebody has retired, if somebody has left the geosciences, and so on. So we've been thinking of a potential model that on an annual basis, we just ask people if they still will continue as a SESAR user in the next year. I've called it a membership model, but it would clearly be a membership without fee in this context here. It's just sending out an annual reminder, so to say, can you confirm that you're still going to use SESAR in the future? So let us know if that would create any hurdles on your side. this has already come up, so I can actually skip this, I think. Yeah, then a really important question for us is, how can we better stay in touch with the users of SESAR and the broader community? There is quite often, we get to the moment where it's like, oh, we would like to let people know there is going to be a downtime. There is a change to the metadata or something like this. And our mailing list hasn't been, the greatest. So the question is it okay with everybody if we use simply the email addresses that we have in the system to advertise or to communicate about any things? And the other aspect is, what type of communication both ways can we set up that will allow you in an easy way to make suggestions for feature improvements or complaints or a hooray about something, just to let us have our fingers better on the pulse of the community and understand where things work well and where things don't work so well. We also would like to know, is the support that we're currently providing sufficient? Is additional training needed? How can we provide that? Are short YouTube videos better than, biannual webinars about new features and so on? And that brings me really to that next question: how can SESAR support the ESIP physical sample cluster, or vice versa? How can SESAR benefit from the ESIP physical samples cluster, maybe in relation to this training, in relation to ongoing communication? And are there any other ways how SESAR can engage with the community? I see there are comments, but not particularly to this topic. So, as I just said, SAPES put a link in the chat. If you open that, put your thoughts after this is over in, or we will keep it definitely up and running, so you can continue to give us feedback through, just writing us your views. But there is also the survey, and here it is. This will take you to a Google form to fill out. I think it's kind of your usual questions where you just rate on a range of 1 to 5 if things are good or not so good. I leave this up for a moment, but I know we're 2 minutes left, so just any reaction you have to what we've been presenting would be really great to hear. And emails to me personally are fine. Emails to info@geosamples.org are fine. Or, bring things up when you run into me at whatever conference comes up. But we really, really want to hear more from users, and, spread the news to your colleagues and so on, so that we can incorporate as much of the feedback into our upcoming developments as possible. Is there...
Just to let you know, the link to the questionnaire is the same one that I sent earlier as a reminder for the meeting. So if you have already filled it out, you don't have to do it again. Just FYI. Yeah. And thank you for those who did fill it out. Thank you.
And others on the team, like say Dave, Sean, they all there to answer question. Anything more technical should probably go to Sean and Dave. Vocabularies may also be a good thing to ask Steve Richard on here, and with respect to the whole sample registration process and the review of batch registrations and so on. That's all in SAPES court, and yeah, and I'm always there to have a chat about any other ideas that you may have. Hopefully this was useful in any way. And I'm really thankful to the co-chairs of the ESIP Physical Samples Cluster to have provided us with this opportunity to get in touch with so many of you.